Welcome everyone once again to the Greener Hub webinar series. My name is Evelyn Zuniga and I am one of the communications officers for the Greener Hub project. The Greener Hub project officially started in September 2022 as a coordination and support action funded by the Horizon Europe program, and it currently represents 15 ERANETs, co-funds, and self-sustained initiatives in the field of agri-food and biotechnology. We started these breakfast clubs last year in October. And the topic of our first series was circularity in agriculture. Then we moved towards biotechnology to advance sustainable solutions for bioeconomy. So if you're related in topics like mixed farming system, mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, sustainable farming, production of bioplastics, among others, all of our recordings are now on YouTube. For these 4 months, we have been going into the topic of sustainable food systems, where we have been having topics like selling agriculture, food resilience and climate change, food trade, among many others. And these are already in YouTube as well. Just a few housekeeping announcements. Please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box, and the chat section are already activated. At any time, you can put your question. I'm going to do my best to address as many questions as possible with the time that we have, which is 1 hour. Today, we have the pleasure to have two panelists, Dr. Lilliana Stefanovic and Dr. Richard Lynch. Today, we're going to open our presentations, our round of presentations with Dr. Stefanovic, who is currently working as a research associate at the Department of Organic Food Quality at the University of Kassel in Germany. Dr. Stefanovic's research is focused on analyzing transformative potential of organic food systems in relation to the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Dr. Stefanovic has been actively involved in the coordination of collaborative projects and the teaching of different modules like consumer science and sustainable consumption, sustainable diets, principles of organic farming, and recent development in food and nutritional sciences for master degree programs. And she has been the coordinator of the transnational project CIS.org, which is part of the SUSFood2 ERANET. Today, the title of her presentation is Organic Agro-Food Systems as Model for Sustainable Food Systems in Europe and Northern Africa. And this part, as I said before, of the SUSFood2 initiative. Dr. Stefanovic, thank you very much for joining us today and for giving us some insights on your projects. And I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and you can start sharing your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Evelyn. It's my pleasure to be part of this format and be able to present my project that was just finished at the end of June this year. Yes, so you have already named it. The acronym of the project is CIS.org, and we have just finished it, and I will present briefly introduction, just the background of the project, our approach, and how we implemented our project. And then, of course, I will be more than happy to provide some insights into the results that we obtained. All right, so what was the background of this project? As Evelyn already mentioned, it was part of the joint call of CIS FastFood2 Core Organic Call 2019 within the joint ERANET, FastFood2 and Core Organic Fund. And there were two topics. And the topic we were part of was resource efficient, circular and zero waste food systems. And overall, there have been 3 food system related projects. So we are one of the 3 funded projects within this call. All right, so our project term was initially set for 3 years between January 2021 and back then we were supposed to finish in December 2023, but we were granted a 6-month extension. So we were all in all 7 partners from 5 countries in Europe and North Africa. You can see all the partners up at the bottom of the slide. So the University of Kassel I'm representing, we coordinated the project, and the other partners were in charge of various perspectives. All right, so what was the aim of this project? We aimed actually to identify some common entry points for a shift towards more sustainable and resilient food system in order to be able to successfully design pathways for increasing sustainable food production and consumption. And for that, it was vital to have a better understanding of food systems overall in a systems approach, including the multitude of actors involved therein, and to be able to identify the critical points within the systems. So the questions we asked ourselves specifically were, for instance, what is the common understanding of sustainability in order to be able to drive the transformation towards sustainable food systems? Second question we asked ourselves was, how can the pathways to increase sustainable food production and consumption across the system be actually successfully designed? What are those reasons, motivations, but also drivers and barriers that actually enable actors to opt for more sustainable solutions or prevent them from doing so? And finally, what are the promising entry points for developing, consolidating, and also disseminating organic food and farming, which was our organic perspective, then reducing waste, which was our waste perspective, and shifting towards sustainable and healthy diets, our diets perspective. And then what would be the critical points in order to bring those perspectives together in a systems approach? As you could see, a quite complex endeavor. So in order to be able to do just that, we decided to map and analyze 5 case territories, basically in those territories where our project partners were based, from 4 various perspectives in a transdisciplinary way. So let's start with the 5 case territories. I don't know if you can clearly see, but I will mention them orally. So the first one was the municipality of Copenhagen in Denmark. The second one is the capital city Warsaw in Poland. The third one is eco-model region North Hessia in Germany. The fourth is the bi-district Cilento in Italy. And finally, the fifth is the province of Kenitra in Morocco. And what were our 4 perspectives from which we actually approached these territories and analyzed the respective territorial systems? One was the diet perspective, mainly shifting towards sustainable and healthy diets. The second one was enhancing organic food and farming in the territories, which was our organic perspective. The third one was reducing waste, or our waste perspective. And finally, system transition, which was our transition perspective in the project. And basically in each of the case territories, we zeroed in on all the 4 perspectives. All right, so how did we actually go about it methodologically? Our consortium and partners developed 2 methodological guidelines. Part 1 on the top part was actually aimed at doing the case study work in the 5 case study territories. And the second one was aimed at doing the cross-case comparison analysis later on of our case territories. We had 2 units of study in our project. One was the initiatives in the territories dealing with transforming the food systems, and the second one was the households. For the initiatives, we actually analyzed those for all the 4 perspectives, meaning diet, organic, waste, and transition, whereby households was only our unit of study for diet, organic, and waste. As for sampling for the initiatives, we relied on a 3 to 4 step selection procedure, including collecting, screening, and mapping of the initiatives. And for the transition perspective, additionally, we conducted in-depth investigation. So there, as a method, we relied on semi-structured interviews, and for the transition perspective, also 1 in-depth interview per territory. As for the households, we relied on reverse sampling technique, and our target was initially 500 households per case territory. And here we conducted an online survey using a semi-structured questionnaire. And for each of our case territories, we, of course, initially conducted in-depth desk research for each of the 4 project perspectives. All right, so let's take a look at our results. So first of all, our aim with 500 households per case territory in the end was not quite reached in each of the territories, unfortunately, but nevertheless, all in all, we ended up by having over 2,000 respondents in our household survey, which is not a bad number. It's a good one to work with, and you can see 500 was actually reached, for instance, in Cilento and North Hessia, and almost reached in Warsaw as well. All right, for the initiatives, we ended up by having all in all 17 initiatives being interviewed in the mapping phase for the transition perspective, plus a number of interviews also for the other perspectives. And for instance, zooming in on the results from the diet and waste perspective and looking into dietary composition, for instance, as this was reported in our household survey, we could see, for instance, that the case territories where the share of plant-based consumption in the overall food consumption, which was self-reported by our respondents, was or appeared to be the highest in Cilento, Copenhagen, and North Hessia, and Warsaw as well. If we look at the household food waste, we can see different distribution according to various types of food waste, as these were self-reported by our respondents. And here, for instance, we could see that partially used food was dominating in the territories such as Cilento, Warsaw, and Copenhagen. For Kenitra, the dominating waste category were meal leftovers, and for North Hessia, it was actually leftovers after storage, which points to tailored recommendations in this regard, how to go about, for instance, leftovers in these territories. All right, looking at the results from cross-case analysis that we conducted for each of the 4 perspectives, and specifically starting with the diet, we could observe discrepancy in the food-based dietary guidelines at the national levels in the countries studied. For instance, there was no recommendation in Morocco, whereby in other countries there was a wide range of different guidelines varying in scope as well as level of detail. So, for instance, ranging from 1 page to 200 pages, which is quite a discrepancy. However, we were also able to identify certain commonalities. For instance, the main message of reducing meat consumption and increasing plant-based foods in a diet. Then looking at the self-reported diets, for instance, we were able to see that Copenhagen and Warsaw appeared to be the territories where our respondents reported actually overall healthier consumption patterns, more in line with the recommendations of the Planetary Health Diet. As for the Mediterranean diet, which was also a point of interest for us in our Mediterranean case territories, such as Morocco and Cilento, unfortunately, the adherence level appeared to be quite low to the Mediterranean diet. But on the positive note, when looking into the statements pointing towards the willingness to change diets towards more sustainable ones, here in all the territories, the respondents were actually claiming this willingness, and in specifics, they were, or the majority were actually stating that they would be willing to incorporate, for instance, more seasonal and local foods into their diet, but also to reduce their meat consumption. Looking at the organic perspective here, our territories were in various stages of the organic transformation. For instance, Copenhagen, North Hessia, and Cilento were quite advanced in this regard, whereby Kenitra and Warsaw are rather at the early stage of their organic transformation, which was well reflected in our survey results, showing that the highest share of organic foods in the diet was, for instance, reported in Copenhagen and North Hessia. whereby, for instance, Cilento respondents rather tend to rely on a non-certified organic food, which was also an interesting finding. We were able to see that our respondents tend to associate organic with sustainable food. The only exception for this strong association was in Kenitra. Among the factors that actually prevent the households from increasing consumption of their organic food was number one, or top one was price as a barrier in order to increase or actually consume organic foods in the first place. And finally, when we looked at the increase of the organic foods in the diet over the past 5 years, here all the territories were reporting such an increase according to our household survey results, except for Kenitra. Looking at waste, we actually examined the existence of policies for food waste reduction or certain programs, and we detected no such policies in Morocco, for instance, whereby all the other territories did have some policies and programs in that regard. We were able to quantify the food waste per household per week. The mean value was 399 grams per household and week, or 153 grams per person and week. The lowest estimated food waste levels were reported for North Hessia, the highest for Kenitra, whereby we were able to see actually correlation between the family size or the number of household members in a family and the total food waste reported, meaning that the highest number per household didn't necessarily translate into the highest per person food waste. And as a matter of fact, in Kenitra, we had the largest households, and therefore per household food waste was the highest, but the lowest per person, which is also an interesting finding. And typology of food waste also differed between the countries, as we were able to see on the previous slide. Finally, coming to the transition results, we were able to detect a sizable number of initiatives acting in each of the case territories in order to transform the food system towards a more sustainable one. And generally, those initiatives seem to be active in more than one field of activity. For instance, a lot of them are promoting sustainable diets, for instance, through public meals or in restaurants. But there are also educational activities and programs offered by various initiatives in the territories. There is also networking work being done, but also, for instance, the food waste initiatives tend to be very active in distributing food surpluses to socially disadvantaged, for instance. We also asked our initiatives what barriers and drivers they perceive for the activity they perform in the territories. And for instance, an interesting finding was that politics, law, and regulations tend to present certain level of barriers, whereby other political aspects or some financial aspects were reported to be drivers. Raised awareness was reported as an actually big driver towards transforming a food system, and here specifically awareness towards the need for the transformation in the first place. Also, other initiatives, networking and civil societies can act as drivers for the initiatives active in the territories, whereby food culture, for instance, was reported as a barrier towards expressing more sustainable behaviors in the population, and therefore for the initiatives to bring this forward. And finally, there was an essential point emphasized by our interviewed initiatives, which is a role of collaboration, which was reported to be of very high importance in order for the efforts of these initiatives to actually drive some change. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I would be ready to answer your questions, and I would be more than happy to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stefanovic. I just want to remind everyone you can put your questions in the Q&A section and in the chat box. So while you do so, I do have some questions. I read in the paper about Kenitra in Morocco that bread was identified like one of the most wasted items in Kenitra. So what factors do you think make bread more prone to be wasted compared to like meat or cereals, for example?
That's a very good question. We were actually discussing in a number of rounds, and it might be that it's a staple food and the awareness is simply not there about the value of bread, because it's something that people have on everyday basis and that is very common and rather cheap. So that might be awareness-based factor simply. And the other factor, they don't really probably know how to reuse it. If it gets old, this is something, for example, we were able to see in the public canteens in Copenhagen, how they go about this problem in order to avoid food waste vis-a-vis bread specifically. So they are actually processing it into a meal next day. And that was perhaps something that should be promoted in Kenitra as well. So that might be also lack of this know-how on how to go about leftovers, or if the bread is no longer fresh, or that you can actually freeze it in the first place as well.
Yeah, that's what I do. Actually, this is why it's important, like this kind of projects transnational, because you can bring things from different countries that you didn't think they do that until you go like, oh yeah, but actually we can freeze the bread. Like, why not? Because some people have this conception of like, I don't know, like it's gonna change the taste. Maybe, I don't know, a little bit, but for me, like I do freeze my bread because I hate to waste anything. So if it's like has been sitting there for, I don't know, 4 days, I know that it might start getting like moldy. I just go and freeze it. And then when you toast it, is the same. Like, and it's just, and if you have access to a freezer, I was thinking that maybe in some parts could be like accessibility to fridge or freezers, maybe it's different, but if you have access to a freezer, like there are so many things that you can freeze instead of throw away. Like if you have spinach, then you can freeze it and use it as a smoothie, not for like a salad. So there are like different solutions
Exactly.
that could be like incorporated. So yeah, that's great about these kind of projects, that you can bring knowledge from different parts of the world. um I have other question here. So what do you think could be like maybe short or long-term solutions to reducing the impact, like the food waste in like these different countries? Let's take, for example, Kenitra. Like what measures could be kind of implemented?
Well, the hope would be to first of all try to avoid and prevent in the first place. So that would be the ultimate goal, I would say. And that was the idea behind actually trying to quantify and looking into typology of food waste, so as to actually try to develop these tailored recommendations for each of the territory, which we ultimately did. But the other thing is how to actually go about it, how to reach out to the households. And that would be something interesting to look into, because one thing is to present at a scientific conference, and another thing is to come down to people and actually try to carry it out into the masses, so that the people could maybe, get some hacks on how to go about this. So ideally, what we would want to see is that we can avoid the food waste. And therefore, we actually interviewed those food waste initiatives and what are the barriers and drivers for them. And for instance, for them, a big barrier was that there are certain regulations in place or certain hygiene requirements,
Yeah.
which actually prevent them from doing more. And this was something, or even lack of collaboration at this level, because a lot of producers, retailers would just perceive it as extra work linked to extra human resources, extra hours for their employees, which they might not be able to have. in order to actually be able to donate, prepare this food or leftovers for donation. And for that, simply in some of our responses, our interviewees said it's easier for us to just discard it than to actually prepare it for donation. And that was a sad outcome, because that's certainly not how it should be. But then there were some initiatives that are very successful in redistributing those surpluses. And this is also something that should be more promoted, and also in countries or territories like Morocco as well.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I use there are apps, and that was kind of my next question. So, as in, how do you think technology can reduce food waste in households? And I know there are apps, and I used apps that are like if you type in your Play Store food waste, you will find like the different apps that you could have like around you, because there are some that apply in the US and in Europe, but not in, I don't know, in some parts of Africa or in South America and stuff like that. So what do you think is the role of maybe of technology to help on this?
Actually quite significant from my point of view, because these apps could be taken to the next level. Yes, there are some niche initiatives offering such apps right now, but they are not widely available just yet. And it would be really nice if you could like donate food easily via apps, or it could be also that you could have it being picked up and brought to some central distribution point.
Yeah.
Of course, it requires extra resources. Of course, it does. But in my opinion, in the era of technology, this is crucial. If we do want to bring about the change, there should be apps like that aimed at the private households, not just for the industry. For example, I am traveling in 2 days, so I can just post the foods that I still have in stock, and I can post it, and someone can pick it up for free, because I just don't want it to get wasted. And of course, if it's all connected to an app, it would be very easy to do. And instead of going somewhere to the other corner of the city and trying, you might not even find time to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So that could be, in my opinion, actually the next step, how to go about the
Yeah,
food
that's
waste.
that's absolutely right. And there is an app that I use that it kind of relies a lot of kind of volunteering from people. And you would like we underestimate the capacity of people of volunteering and how much they want to help to reduce food waste. Like there's so many people volunteering to, let's say, take surplus from the shops and then have it in their house and then distributing them. So this is a fantastic app that I have found. Um, Lately. So I think yeah, it's very important to try and maybe just appeal towards like how people can contribute. Like it's more work for kind of the workers in the retail part, but there's also people who want to volunteer and help.
Yes, that is another point that actually our initiatives specified as a barrier is lack of public engagement, that the people, the public, are not actually engaged enough in the efforts even put forward by the initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
There's just not enough from the people coming the other way. So if that could be somehow promoted,
Yeah.
I don't know, by the initiatives or perhaps by public authorities. So at that point, just to make even people aware of these initiatives in the
Yeah.
first place.
Yeah, I feel like there is like a lack of like when you're watching TV, if you see like this kind of publicity of these apps that are like you can actually download and be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna explore this, and but you don't see these kind of things like kind of on widespread like media. It's just kind of here and there in Facebook or LinkedIn, so it's hard to kind of to have access to the information. But as we have one question here, so it says if you have like formed any collaborations with the authorities related to this as part of the project.
We have conducted some work in the territories, and we do have some contacts, but it is territory dependent. In some territories, it's easier than in others. So we are planning actually a follow-up, and I do hope that our findings from this project can be transferred into the next one and taken to the next level, so that we can actually also move to the next step and not just stay at where we are. Okay, we have some findings, we did formulate some recommendations, but it's out there and there's nothing that can be done as a next step. We actually want to take it up, and I do hope that we can still continue where we stopped, actually.
Yeah,
So
that
yes, there is a certain collaboration, but like I said, it's territory specific. For
yeah,
instance,
exactly.
Cilento is very active in Italy, also Copenhagen in Denmark. But of course, it's a little bit different level of engagement, for instance, in Kenitra, unfortunately. And they are unfortunately not going to become partners of our next endeavor. So that is sad, because that would be very interesting to have them on board. But yeah, we'll try to work further with the territories where we do have some collaboration for sure.
Okay, yeah, that's fantastic to hear that, like the research is try to be like moved into policy somehow, try to work. It's not that easy. And then when you kind of reach the policy point of view, they kind of tell you, oh, like there are all of these barriers, and you're like, okay, so let's talk together and try to make it work for everyone. I think I'm gonna leave it like this. Thank you very much, Dr. Stefanovic, for joining us today and for sharing all the results of your project. It's super interesting. I really love this topic. Thank you so much.
My
And
pleasure.
thank you. And now we're going to continue with Dr. Richard Lynch. Dr. Richard Lynch, thank you very much for joining us today. Dr. Lynch is a research officer at the cereals at the crop science department in Teagasc in Ireland. His research interests include sustainable agriculture, food systems, and livestock management, with a particular focus on integrating sustainability into production processes. Currently, he is actively engaged in the VALPRO Path project, where his consortium investigates innovative strategies for incorporating plant-based proteins into food systems, aiming to enhance sustainability and address future global food needs. The title of his project today is VALPRO Path, Foraging the Path for Protein Sufficiency, which is funded by Horizon Europe. Dr. Lynch, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm just gonna stop sharing my screen, and you can start your presentation. Thank you so much for letting us know about your project.
Inviting me, Evelyn. Okay, just 1 second. I'll share my screen here. Okay, so as Evelyn has just said, I'm going to speak to you about, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to speak to you about how to forge a path, or forging a path to protein sufficiency. And specifically, I'm going to talk about protein sufficiency in Europe. So as I won't give myself too much of an introduction, but I work in Teagasc as a crops researcher in the crops department. And Teagasc, as if anybody doesn't know, is the Agricultural and Food Development Authority in the Republic of Ireland. So I'm going to start off very easily, because I wasn't sure whether or not I was the first on the bill this morning, and I didn't want to overwhelm people too much too soon. So I'm going to start off with what the Americans would call a Biology 101. A very basic breakdown as to what proteins are and how they're important in our everyday lives. So I suppose proteins for living organisms are very important for a number of activities within the body. So enzymatic activity, immunity for cells, cell signaling, and muscle work. So that's the building of muscles and repair of muscles and so on. But they're also a very important source of dietary energy for living organisms, and that's not to be overlooked. And certain cohorts, I suppose, require very high levels of protein at specific times. So infants, active adults, pregnant mothers, and the mature population require a higher level of protein than they would normally require in other parts of their lives. So it's important to understand that when we talk about the protein intake and requirement of people. And in terms of the requirement, I suppose in Europe, the European Food Safety Authority have stated that the reference intake for the average adult should be between 0.6 and 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, and that's on a daily basis. However, most European adults consume well above this, in fact, nearly double this on a daily basis. So we consume about 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. And of those proteins we consume, they're highly digestible. So really, this is down to the fact that our diet has a lot of animal-based proteins in it, which are very complete and provide all the amino acids we need. So I suppose to provide a complete understatement is that the average European consumes a sufficient amount of protein, which in a way negates the title that I've put up on my slide. However, I suppose it's important to understand what form of protein the average European consumes. And sorry, there's just a slight delay here. This is a table I would have pulled from that the European Food Safety Authority produced a good few years back, almost 10 years ago now, but I think it's a great overview of the types of protein that Europeans consume on a daily basis. And it's broke down by country. So on the left-hand side, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in this table, but I just singled out Ireland here because it's the country, obviously, that I'm based. But we can see in Ireland that over 60% of all the protein that's consumed is from animal-based sources, and then less than 40% is sourced from plant-based. And this is similar across most of these European countries that are on this map. So generally in Europe, we see there's a 60-40 ratio of animal to plant-based protein that's consumed on a daily basis. And then the question that's always thrown out there, and people always ask, is what is the correct balance? And I suppose to understand what the correct balance is, it's very important to understand what are the positives and negatives of consuming both types of protein. So for animal proteins, as I said, they're a complete protein source. So in that, what I mean is that they contain all 9 essential amino acids that the body can't produce and therefore has to intake on a daily basis. Animal proteins are highly digestible, and as we all know, they're very palatable. So for those that do eat animal-based proteins and they like to eat a nice steak, we know it's a very palatable source of protein. In terms of the negatives, obviously there are some concerns with overconsumption of animal-based proteins. And then obviously there's ethical concerns with intensification of animal-based systems to produce animal-based proteins, and whether it's the pig, poultry, or the ruminant sectors, they have all, to a certain degree, intensified and have had some issues with animal welfare and so on. There's also environmental concerns with intensive systems, and this is with the inputs required to maintain these systems and manage them. In terms of plants are very high in fiber. They contain a lot of minerals, a lot of vitamins, and of course they are very low in cholesterol, so they're good for our health. They have the potential in cropping systems to reduce the amount of chemical inputs that are used. And specifically, this is related to legumes in plant protein or plant cropping systems. So legumes, as we know, can fix nitrogen, so that reduces the nitrogen need in cropping systems, but also because they're a very important break crop in that they can break disease cycles, they can reduce the amount of pesticides and chemicals that are used that would be otherwise used in cropping systems. However, they're less digestible, plants as they are in the raw form, and they don't have a complete amino acid balance. So we know that specifically cereals are low in lysine, one of the essential amino acids, and plant proteins or legumes can be low in cytine and methionine. So there's a need then to ensure that there's a balance of legumes or plant-based sources to balance the amino acid profile that's been taken in on a daily basis. And also there's a need, I suppose, to make these plants more palatable to in a human diet. So some form of processing is needed to do this. So then the question is, what is the best balance? Is it 60-40 as we have? Is it the status quo, 60% animal protein and 40% plant? Or should it shift to maybe half and half? Or even some people would argue it should shift to maybe a higher percentage of plant-based proteins in the diet. Now, you'd be sad to know that this is way beyond my expertise, and it's not something I'm going to argue in this presentation. However, what I can say to you is, if we do decide to intake plants, plant-based sources, what is the best way to do this, and how can we improve and make sure that there's an available source of plant-based material so that European consumers have options within their diet. So the layout of this presentation really will follow four main points. The first one will be a very brief overview of the way in which plant proteins are consumed and thus the current demand in Europe. Secondly, I'd like to give a very brief overview of the amount and the type of plant proteins currently produced. So the first one is consumed and the second one is how we produce them. And then I want to have a look really in depth at the plant protein sector in Europe and its mechanics. And finally, then I want to speak about a project which I manage called VALPRO Path that's looking to improve some of these structural failures, I suppose, in the plant protein sector in Europe. So if we want to talk about in terms of how it's consumed in Europe, overwhelmingly, most of the plant proteins that are produced are consumed by the animal feed sector. So the poultry, pig and ruminant sector consume almost 97% of all those plant proteins, whether they're produced within Europe or imported to Europe. The human food chain or the human food sector consumes about 3% of all those that are consumed in Europe. So this is both those that are imported and those produced indigenously in Europe. However, in terms of value, the highest value market really is the human food market. Albeit the animal-based market is a very important market and needs to be kept. We need to have plant proteins to maintain this as well. So in terms of what does production look like in terms of plant proteins across Europe, and how are we producing our own plant proteins here in Europe? So 75% of all the plant protein that's produced is in the form of cereals and grassland. So this is low value really in terms of its protein quality or protein. I wouldn't say quality, sorry, it's protein content. So it's below 15% protein percentage. There are about 25% of high value crops, I suppose, produced across Europe. And these would be the likes of lupins, soybean, chickpea, lentils, peas, and beans, and so on. So these are high value in that they're greater than 15%. And they also, as I will show in my future slides, in my next few slides, that they have the potential to offer a higher value return for the industry as a whole. So the questions are really, can we grow more high protein crops in Europe? So can we reduce the impact of having to import some of these protein crops into Europe? And can we utilize the crops that we do grow to a better effect to generate higher value and maintain the sector? So the answer is very complex, and I'm going to try and explain why it's so complex in my next slide. So really, if we take a look at the sector in Europe and how it stands, we start off really with the ground level, really at the farm level. And we look at how a farmer, the question a farmer might have, and that is, should they grow more protein crops or grow protein crops, full stop. And there's three factors that impact this farmer's decision. The first one is obviously, will they generate a return on their crop? The second is, do they have sufficient agronomic knowledge? So knowledge on how to grow the crop, and would they have machinery available to actually harvest and maintain that crop as it grows? And then I suppose a very important one in Europe at the moment is the availability of suitable seed for some of these plant protein crops or legumes. And when I say suitable, number one, the availability of seed is an issue, but also the right seed, so the right crop, the right variety to grow in the right location is a very important consideration for a farmer to make sure that they maximize their yield and overall then their return. At the moment, however, in terms of return on the crop, farmers are sending any crops that they do produce in terms of protein crops to the animal feed sector. So as I said, this is a low value market, which ultimately reduces the amount of protein crops that are potentially grown in Europe, as farmers don't see this as a financially attractive proposition. The amount of plant protein then available is subsequently affected by the amount of farmers growing these crops. And this has a knock-on effect then on the amount of processors that are available. So the processor is a very important link in the value chain. And in terms of processing, they want to know before they establish a processing plant, is there available plant protein as a raw material to begin? Also, is there an availability of efficient and affordable technologies to add value to these plant-based sources, and ultimately generate a profit. The next, I suppose, important factor in all of this is the food manufacturer that takes this ingredient. And this ingredient produced by the processor in terms of either a flour or concentrated protein is highly reliant on the amount of processing infrastructure that's available, but also it's reliant on the amount of consumer demand. So whether or not a food manufacturer decides to actually get into the business of producing a product from plant proteins is reliant on those two factors. And consumer demand in itself is really a factor of the availability of healthy products with a good taste and texture profile. So consumers want these main attributes in any product that they consume that has plant proteins. So really the processing sector is responsible for producing ingredients that have a good taste and texture profile when they're implemented into food and food ingredients. And as a result, then, if all of this value chain links up as it should here on the slide, or as it could, we generate a higher value market for plant protein in Europe, which returns then to the farmer and ultimately incentivizes the farmer to grow more crops. And then not to forget about the important animal feed sector, there is the potential for those side streams from the processing industry to go back into the animal feed sector. So ultimately, if we were to design the optimum value chain really on your screen, this is what it should look like. However, as I said, there's a number of issues, and this is where the project that I'm managing comes in to try and address some of those issues. So the project is known as VALPRO Path. It's an acronym for New Value Pathways for Plant Protein across Europe. And its core ambition is to demonstrate innovative uses for plant protein crops in order to deliver new value chains. So really, to break this down into simple language, what we want to do is address some of those unanswered questions that producers, processors, and food manufacturers have before they begin on their journey. And the crops that we're looking at in VALPRO Path are some of those high protein crops that I just mentioned. So we're looking at lupins, soybean, chickpea, lentils, peas and beans, and peanut. And the reason I suppose we're looking at these crops is that they've above 15% protein content. They can all fix nitrogen, so they're very important return to the environment. They're suitable to the European climate, climatic conditions, and they've the potential to generate a high premium when processed slightly further. So in terms of some of the work that we began on our journey in the project we began by having a look at what's called the gaps and the obstacles in the plant protein sector in Europe. So really what I just showed to you in that the second slide just before the last one, the overall obstacles that exist in terms of the linkages across the value chain. We conducted a number of expert interviews. We had a literature review, large-scale literature review, and we had a number of stakeholder workshops to have a look at what are the main gaps and obstacles. And really, we produced then at the end of this what we call a gap analysis. And from that, we produced a very intuitive map. So it's a digital tool that you can access via our website on VALPRO Path. And it's called Feeling the Pulse. So really it goes and it breaks down each stage of the value chain and the main obstacles and challenges within those. Then once we knew what our challenges were from the very beginning, we set about seeing what is the level of processing that can be done both close to the farm gate or removed from the farm gate, so at a central location. So we've employed a university to conduct some work on an optimization model to really have a look at what is the best location for certain elements of the processing across the value chain. And this is an important consideration in order to justify the transport and environmental impact that we would have in locating one of these facilities. And then also to have a look at the side streams that can be generated and utilized within that area and so on. So really we want to grow the right crop, we want to process it in the right place, and we want to have it for the right market. In terms of the varieties then, we're doing a lot of varietal testing, and we're looking at specific crops, as I mentioned, lupins, field pea, faba beans, chickpea, lentil, and peanut across 5 regions in Europe. So Ireland, Denmark, Germany, Italy, and Portugal. And we're looking at phenotypic data, resilience to abiotic stressors, so that's drought. So a very important consideration with the effects of climate change. And then the selection of really the highest value crops, so that's the one that generates the highest value protein content and can generate the highest value when processed into a food ingredient or feed ingredient. And we generate a database based on this then with different varieties and so on. So this will be one of the main outputs from the project, and we're just in our preliminary draft at the moment. We're also looking at different technologies that we can implement to try and add more value to these plant protein crops. So we're looking at on-farm pre-processing, so anything that can be done at the farm level to help keep some of these profits at the farm gate, to make sure that farmers are incentivized to grow these crops. We're looking at methods of cleaning the crops as they come off the field, sorting them, dehulling, so removing the outside hull, which contains a lot of, I suppose, compounds that humans find undesirable, and then to mill them down into a flour. We're also looking at fermentation and extrusion as technologies to try and add texture and taste to the product. And then wet versus dry fractionation to try and isolate the protein and the starch content from these products going forward. Apologies, slideshow. And finally, then we're looking at trying to capture data to develop a nutrient tracking dashboard. So really where we can track from field to fork how the nutrients flow and to make sure that we optimize the use of nutrients throughout the growth cycle and the processing, and then the end product formulation of these plant protein products. So in terms of end product formulation, we're also looking at how we can use these crops then going forward. So we're looking at the utilization of pea and bean flour in confectionery and baked products. We have done some work on plant-based beverages, producing a sports-based beverage with a number of some of these plant sources. We're looking at meat and hybrid plant-based products, and obviously, and then also pastas, which are obviously a highly consumed carbohydrate source across Europe. And instead of your traditional wheat-based and semolina-based pasta, we're using legumes or legume flour. A final thing we're looking to do is to do a full life cycle analysis from farm to fork, which includes the economic, environmental, and social aspects of these systems. And we're collecting this information through farm management information systems. Finally, I suppose once we have all this information, the idea really here is to generate valuable business models. So we have a number of multiple business models we're looking at across the project, the 4 years of the project. And the idea is really, if we can demonstrate that these are viable business models, we give confidence to the stakeholders to transition more towards a plant protein sector and have more availability of these plant proteins so that there is choice for European consumers. The project then, just in a very brief nutshell, is started in September 2022 and it runs for 4 years. So we're at the midway point at the moment. It's a Horizon European funded project that received about 10 million euro in European funding. And we have a large mix of both industrial and academic partners. So it's important that in order that we get our products onto the ground and get our knowledge transferred to those that are really going to apply it in industry, that we had a large connection with industry. And as I mentioned, I manage the project, but the overall coordination is done by Teagasc. And the coordinator is Dr. Ewan Mullins in the Crop Science Department. I work as a project manager. If you want to find out more of the project, the easiest place to start is at our website. You'll see the link on our screen here. And that's it really from me. I'm open to any questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lynch, for your presentation. It's nice to see how we can explore like different sources of protein, like besides what we already like eating. And so just to remind everyone, you can put your question in the chat or in the Q&A section. You mentioned something about the availability of suitable seed. Why now is that an issue? Like how is what's the problem there?
Yeah, so I suppose there's a number of factors in this. The first is mainstream crops, cereals, so your wheat and your barley and so on. Obviously, because they're growing at such a large level, a lot of the research and funding for the past decades would have gone into growing and producing more varieties for these types of crops. And as a result, then okay, the research element, they can produce, they can select the right varieties for the best regions and so on. But then the propagators, so those seed people that will really get it out to seed suppliers, to farmers, they latch on to these new varieties more so than the legume varieties because there's less available. So ultimately, it's a kind of a chicken and egg situation. We don't have the research, we don't have the varieties tested that are most suitable. Then the propagators or the seed suppliers don't have that seed available then to push out to farmers and so on. And then there's an issue, obviously, because there's not such, because farmers aren't growing it, obviously there's not a market for it. So the seed suppliers are not purchasing the seed and they don't have large stocks of it. So if a farmer in the morning decides all of a sudden to begin growing it, or a large number of farmers, we've issues with trying to access this seed. So there's a whole kind of, within that itself, there's a whole issue that needs to be addressed. And I suppose varietal selection, choosing the right variety in the right place is the first place to start.
Yeah.
For that.
Definitely. We have a question from Dr. Stefanovic. So are you planning on investigating the consumer acceptance on plant protein-based products?
Yeah, so I suppose this is one of a number of projects in Cluster 6 of Horizon Europe. And like, as we know, the plant protein sector is a very complex system, like most systems. And so we focused on the earlier stages of that value chain with the seed manufacture, the processing, and so on. This in terms of consumer acceptance, and which is a very, very important side of the whole thing. We wouldn't have the resources to input into this within one project, of course. It is something that we try and link in with other projects on, and there's a number of projects across Europe. One called Giant Leaps, Smart Protein, which is just finished. I'm sure if you're in this space, you would have heard of those. So they've done a lot of work on consumer acceptance of plant proteins. And in fact, there's a great review and publication from the Smart Protein project that the Pro Veg International would have produced on consumer acceptance, and they would have done a very large scale survey across Europe on consumer acceptance of plant proteins. We do have a small element of this, but specifically tailored to the products that we're producing. So whether it's the legume pasta or the plant-based beverage or so on. So it's specific to those, and the results will be available a bit later on.
Oh, right. Yeah, it's a big endeavor for like short time. You see, like you see all what you have presented, all the objectives 4 years is very challenging.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And but I think industry was very close to adopting some of these. They just needed maybe more encouragement. And that's where a project like ours, what we really try to do is bring in as many industrial partners and show that these business models actually work. So we have actual companies producing this pasta, putting it on supermarket shelves across the world, and showing how consumers are buying it. And we're tailoring the product itself in terms of the packaging to make it more attractive, but also the ingredients that's put into the product to make it more functional. So we're balancing the amino acid profile, obviously a very important thing with legume-based products, but also the taste and the texture and the quality. I mean, these are massive in plant-based foods.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned that like in your graph that in the end you need to that sometimes for them to grow the plant protein base for human consumption is not it could not be so profitable for farmers. So what incentives do you think can be put in place to kind of incentivize and be like, okay, so you can grow this and we're like helping you. It's not going to be such a difficult task.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that final arrow that I showed that link right back from the valuable product back to, or the high value market back to the farmer it's a very difficult one to actually do in practice. But we have some working examples. So if I take Ireland for an example, at the moment we have a protein subsidy that's provided to farmers, and this is a direct income support. This encourages the farmers to grow the plant protein crop, and it's actually worked very well. So this year has been the highest by a long shot in terms of the acreage planted in Ireland. But ultimately, this is not really, this is handling, it's like the old saying where you hand somebody per the fish rather than the fishing net so they can catch their fish further on down the line.
Yeah.
So if you provide them just with the support at the beginning, that's fine. But if this is removed, will it just go back to where it was, a zero again? So what we're trying to do is we're trying to develop that model within Ireland and within Europe, where the large processors work with farmers and they say to farmers, this is the variety that we need for the food product or the food ingredient that we're producing. Can you grow it? So really it's down to a contract basis. And they offer a premium to the farmer to grow this at a certain level. So it's so they have to apply certain agronomic practices, maybe reduce their pesticide usage or chemical usage or so on.
Yeah, it's a great link to just get to the farmers with the incentive and then just kind of bring them on the chain of like, yes, you can actually profit out of this and then use these technologies and kind of bring them like along in the process. That's fantastic. I think I'm gonna have to stop the webinar. It's 10:04. This is fantastic talking to everyone here. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Thank you, Dr. Stefanovic. Thank you, Dr. Lynch, for presenting your projects. For the next series of webinars, we're going to change the subject from sustainable food systems to precision farming. So I'll be doing a whole series about this, and I will invite everyone to be present in our next webinar. And for now, that's it. Thank you very much for joining.